Hi guys, imagine a man who could drink enough cyanide to kill an elephant, take bullets to the chest like they were mosquito bites, and bring down a 300-year-old dynasty with nothing but a whisper and a prayer. This is the true, twisted, and absolutely terrifying story of Grigori Rasputin, the peasant mystic who seduced an empress, hijacked the Russian Empire, and became the most hated man in history. Today, we are starting the deep dive into the life of the mad monk to understand how a dirty, illiterate wanderer managed to hold the fate of the world in his hands. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe, and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. We begin our journey not in the golden palaces of St. Petersburg, but in the frozen, unforgiving heart of Siberia, in a tiny, mud-soaked village called Pokrovskoye. It is the late 19th century, a time when the Russian Empire is a land of extreme contrasts, where the glittering aristocracy speaks French and lives in unimaginable luxury, while millions of peasants struggle to survive in medieval conditions. Here, amidst the endless snowdrifts and the howling winds that cut through bone, Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin was born into a world of silence and hardship. He wasn't born a monster, and he certainly wasn't born a saint. He was the son of a peasant who fought against the harsh elements every single day just to keep his family alive. The exact date of his birth is shrouded in mystery, much like everything else in his chaotic life. But we know he grew up in a place where the church bells were the only clock, and survival was the only ambition. As a young man, Rasputin was nothing like the holy figure eventually depicted on icons. In fact, he was the exact opposite of a saint. He gained a notorious reputation in his village not for piety, but for unbridled chaos and disruption. He drank vodka like it was water, he got into fistfights constantly, and he possessed an intense, almost frightening energy that unsettled his neighbours. People in the village whispered that there was something off about Grigori, something wild and untamable in his pale, staring eyes that hinted at a power he didn't yet understand. He was illiterate, like most of his peers, unable to read or write, yet he had a magnetic charisma that allowed him to talk his way out of trouble as easily as he got into it. His early years were marked by petty crimes, horse theft, and a general disregard for social norms, earning him the nickname Rasputin, which many historians later claimed meant the debauched one, though in reality it likely just referred to a muddy crossroads, a fitting metaphor for a man who would eventually stand at the intersection of history and catastrophe. But the life of a simple Siberian drunkard was not his destiny. Something snapped within him in his late 20s, a profound psychological change that historians still struggle to explain fully. Maybe it was a vision induced by exhaustion. Maybe it was the guilt of his sins weighing him down. Or maybe it was a calculated reinvention to escape the toil of farm life. But Rasputin suddenly abandoned his wild ways to seek God. He left his wife and children behind, walking out of the village to wander the vast, empty Russian landscape as a strannik, a holy wanderer. This was a crucial tradition in Russia, where men would travel on foot from monastery to monastery, living on charity, wearing chains to mortify their flesh, and seeking spiritual enlightenment. For Rasputin, this wasn't just a religious journey, it was an education in human psychology. He walked thousands of miles, his feet bleeding in the snow, his body growing lean and hard, his mind absorbing the scriptures and the mystical traditions of the forbidden sects he encountered along the way. He learned the art of reading people, of seeing their deepest fears and hidden desires before they even spoke a word. He spent months in isolation, praying until his voice grew hoarse, developing a theology that was as dangerous as it was seductive. The idea that to be truly saved, one must first sin deeply and repent fully. This concept, known as redemption through sin, would become the cornerstone of his philosophy and the psychological weapon he would later use to disarm the high society of St. Petersburg. As he travelled, rumours of his healing powers began to spread like wildfire. In rural villages, where doctors were scarce and superstition ruled the day, a man who could lay hands on the sick and whisper their pain away was seen as a direct messenger from God. He eventually returned to Pokrovskoye not as the drunken troublemaker everyone remembered, but as a starets, a holy elder, though he was never officially ordained by the Orthodox Church. He built a makeshift chapel in his cellar, where he gathered followers, mostly women, who were drawn to his piercing gaze and his hypnotic rhythmic voice. They sang, they prayed, and according to dark whispers, they engaged in frenzied rituals that blurred the line between spiritual ecstasy and physical passion. This cellar was the incubator for the madness that would follow. He had conquered his village, he had mastered the art of manipulation, and he had forged a connection with the divine that felt terrifyingly real to anyone who stood in his presence. But Siberia was too small for Grigori Rasputin. He felt a magnetic pull towards the capital, towards the centres of power where the true soul of Russia resided. He knew that his unique blend of peasant wisdom, raw sexual charisma, and mystical power was exactly what the superstitious, bored upper class was craving. The stage was set for the most unlikely ascent in human history. The peasant with the dirty fingernails and the burning eyes was about to walk into the golden halls of the Romanovs, and nothing would ever be the same again. This transformation from village outcast to holy wanderer is the foundation of the legend, the calm before the terrible storm that he would unleash upon the world. It was 1903 when the Siberian wanderer finally marched into the glittering, ice-encrusted metropolis of St. Petersburg, the beating heart of the Russian Empire, and he arrived like a bomb waiting to detonate. To understand how Rasputin conquered this city, you have to understand the bizarre psychological state of the Russian aristocracy at the turn of the century, because the timing of his arrival was nothing short of miraculous. The capital was not just a city of ballrooms and military parades. It was a place deeply infected with a morbid obsession for the occult, where bored grand duchesses and aristocratic socialites spent their evenings conducting seances, turning tables, and desperately trying to contact the spirit world. The elite was spiritually starving, disillusioned with the rigid and formal Orthodox Church, and they were actively hunting for something raw, something ancient, something that felt like the real Russia. Into this perfumed, decadent world walked Grigori Rasputin, smelling of wood smoke, sweat, and cheap soap, wearing greasy peasant boots that left muddy tracks on their Persian rugs. He shouldn't have fit in. He should have been laughed out of the drawing rooms, but instead he became an instant sensation. His first major breakthrough came when he managed to charm the rector of the Theological Academy, Bishop Sergius, and the inspector, Archimandrite Theophan, who was the confessor to the Tsar and Tsarina themselves. These high-ranking church officials looked at Rasputin and didn't see a dirty peasant. They saw a starets, a living saint springing from the soil of Holy Russia. Rasputin played the role to perfection, keeping his eyes lowered in mock humility one moment, and then flashing that terrifying, hypnotic glare the next, quoting scripture with a unique, convoluted twist that sounded profound even if it was nonsensical. But the true keys to the palace were held by two women known as the Black Princesses, Militsa and Anastasia of Montenegro. These two sisters were obsessed with mysticism and had a reputation for collecting holy men like other people collected jewellery. They were the gatekeepers to the Empress Alexandra, and when they met Rasputin, they were convinced they had found a prophet. They introduced him to the high society salons, where Rasputin unleashed his full charisma. He treated the noble women with a shocking lack of deference, often addressing them with the informal thou, eating with his hands and speaking in rough, broken sentences that they found delightfully authentic. It was a masochistic dynamic. The more he acted like a boorish peasant, the more they believed in his holiness. He preached that he carried a piece of the true cross within him, and that contact with him was contact with God. Rumours began to circulate immediately about what exactly this contact entailed, with whispers of private meetings where the lines between spiritual guidance and physical seduction were heavily blurred. Rasputin was careful, however. He knew that to reach the ultimate prize, the Tsar and Tsarina, he had to maintain a veneer of absolute piety. He positioned himself as the voice of the common people, the only man who could tell the emperor the truth about the suffering of the peasantry. Meanwhile, in the Winter Palace, a tragedy was unfolding that would make the royal family desperate for a miracle. Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra were hiding a terrible secret from the world. Their only son and heir, the young Tsarevich Alexei, was born with haemophilia, a genetic blood disease where even a small bruise could lead to internal bleeding and agonizing death. The doctors were helpless, the science of the time offered no cure, and the Empress was driving herself into a state of religious hysteria, praying for a saviour. She believed that only a man of God could save her son, and she was ready to believe in anyone who offered hope. The Montenegrin sisters began to whisper in Alexandra's ear about a holy man from Siberia, a man who had the ear of God, a man who could do what the doctors could not. Rasputin knew this was his moment. He had spent months cultivating his image, building a network of powerful supporters in the church and society, and honing his ability to manipulate the desperate. He wasn't just walking into a royal audience, he was walking into a vacuum of power created by a mother's grief and a father's weakness. As 1905 approached, a year that would bring revolution and bloodshed to the streets of Russia, the doors of the Alexander Palace were slowly creaking open for the peasant from Pokrovskoye. He had survived the harsh Siberian wilderness. He had navigated the treacherous waters of the Orthodox hierarchy, and he had seduced the bored wives of St. Petersburg generals. Now he was standing on the precipice of absolute power, preparing to meet the rulers of one of the largest empires on earth, armed with nothing but his fanatic belief in himself and the desperate need of a mother trying to save her dying child. The stage was set for the most fatal introduction in Russian history. It was November 1st, 1905, a day that would be etched in blood in the annals of the Romanov dynasty, when the Tsar entered a simple sentence into his diary. "We have made the acquaintance of a man of God, Grigori, from Tobolsk province." That brief, understated entry marked the beginning of the end, though Nicholas II had absolutely no idea he had just invited his own doom into the palace. The meeting took place at the Peterhof Palace, amidst the golden chandeliers and the hushed reverence of the court. But Rasputin didn't act like a subject meeting his emperor. He acted like a patriarch returning to his wayward children. He walked in, not with the trembling fear that most courtiers displayed, but with a swaggering confidence, immediately embracing the Tsar and Tsarina, and even kissing them. A shocking breach of protocol that would have had anyone else dragged away by the guards. But Alexandra didn't see a breach of protocol. She saw the authenticity she had been craving. To her, the stiff, polite aristocrats were fake, but this peasant, who smelled of the earth and spoke in riddles, was the real Russia, the holy vessel she had been praying for. The bond was cemented almost immediately because Rasputin possessed an uncanny, predator-like ability to sense vulnerability, and he found the ultimate vulnerability in the royal nursery. The Tsarevich Alexei, the future of the dynasty, was a ticking time bomb, his haemophilia a secret so closely guarded that not even the extended family knew the full truth. The royal couple lived in constant agonizing terror that a simple bump on the knee or a nosebleed could kill the heir, and this shared fear isolated them from everyone else in Russia. Rasputin stepped into this circle of fear and did something no doctor could do. He offered absolute certainty. The first time he was called to the boy's bedside during a bleeding episode, the atmosphere in the room was thick with panic. The doctors were fussing, the mother was weeping hysterically, and the boy was screaming in pain. Rasputin entered and simply took charge. He didn't use medicine, he used his presence. He sat by the bed, looked the boy in the eye, and began to tell him traditional Siberian folk tales in a low, droning, hypnotic voice. He placed his large, calloused hand on the boy's forehead, and miraculously the bleeding stopped. Skeptics and modern historians have spent a century trying to debunk this. Was it hypnosis that lowered the boy's blood pressure? Was it simply that Rasputin kicked out the frantic doctors who were stressing the child? Or most compellingly, was it that the doctors of the time were giving the boy aspirin, a blood thinner, to treat his pain, and by sending the doctors away, Rasputin inadvertently saved the boy by stopping the medicine that was killing him? Whatever the scientific reality to Alexandra, it was a miracle from God. She watched the blood stop. She saw her son fall into a peaceful sleep, and in that moment she surrendered her will completely to the Siberian peasant. Rasputin became indispensable. He was no longer just a visitor. He was our friend, a permanent fixture in the shadow of the throne. He told the Empress, "Believe in the power of my prayers, believe in my help and you will be happy." And then he dropped the ultimate anchor. "If I die or you desert me, in 6 months you will lose your son and your throne." It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, binding his own survival to the survival of the empire. He had effectively taken the heir hostage, not with guns, but with fear. From this point on, the Tsar and Tsarina were not ruling Russia alone. There was a third invisible hand on the scepter, a hand that was dirty, uneducated, and guided by voices only he could hear. The aristocracy began to notice the peasants' frequent visits. The guards whispered about his arrogant behaviour, and the first ripples of scandal began to spread through St. Petersburg. But inside the Alexander Palace, the blinds were drawn, and the royal couple was deaf to the warnings. They believed they had found a saint who could protect their family from the cruel world, unaware that this saint was slowly isolating them from their people, their government, and reality itself. The trap was snapped shut, and the holy devil was now the most powerful man in the palace, shielded by the hysterical devotion of an empress who would destroy anyone who dared to speak a word against him. While the empress kissed his hand in the scented boudoir of the palace, believing him to be the reincarnation of Christ, Grigori Rasputin was spending his nights diving headfirst into a debauchery that would make a sailor blush, living a double life that seemed physically impossible for one man to sustain. As soon as the heavy gates of the Tsar's residence closed behind him, the holy man shed his pious skin and transformed into a party animal of biblical proportions, prowling the dark streets of St. Petersburg like a wolf on the hunt. This is where the legend of the mad monk truly begins to take shape, fueled by the endless flow of sweet Madeira wine which he drank by the gallon, and the chaotic, stomping dances he performed in the city's most notorious nightclubs until the sun came up. He became a regular fixture at the Villa Road, a high-end cabaret where the gypsy choirs sang, and Rasputin would drink until he passed out, only to wake up, shout a prayer, and start drinking again. But it wasn't just the alcohol that fueled the scandal. It was the women. His apartment on Gorokovaya Street became the epicenter of a bizarre cult of personality, where a harem of high society ladies, famously dubbed his little ladies, would gather to listen to his ramblings. These weren't just desperate peasants. These were countesses and baronesses, women dripping in diamonds who would sit at his feet, fighting for the privilege of wiping the grease from his beard or cutting his toenails. He treated them with utter contempt, humiliating them, poking them with his fork and whispering crude obscenities in their ears, yet they were mesmerized, believing that his rudeness was a test of their spiritual humility. He preached his dangerous doctrine of redemption through sin with renewed vigor, convincing these sheltered women that they had to debase themselves to kill their pride, and he was all too willing to help them in that process. The secret police, the Okhrana, were terrified. They had agents following Rasputin 24 hours a day, documenting his every move in a file that grew thicker by the hour, famously known as the staircase notes. These reports read like the diary of a madman, detailing orgies in the bathhouses, public flashing in restaurants, and drunken brawls where he would scream, "I am the Tsar's master!" The police chiefs were in a panic, realizing that this man was a walking PR disaster for the monarchy. They desperately tried to show these reports to Nicholas II, hoping to open his eyes to the monster he was harbouring. They presented the Tsar with concrete evidence of Rasputin visiting prostitutes, of him exposing himself in public, of him boasting about his sexual conquest of the Empress. A lie, but a damaging one. Any rational ruler would have exiled Rasputin immediately, but Nicholas was not a rational ruler. He was a man paralysed by his wife's anxiety. When presented with the police reports, Nicholas famously swept them aside, declaring, "Better one Rasputin than 10 hysterics from the Empress." He chose to believe that the police were fabricating the stories to undermine the throne, viewing the factual reports as malicious gossip. This willful blindness was the fatal error. The Tsar essentially gave Rasputin a get-out-of-jail-free card, placing him above the law. Rasputin knew he was untouchable. He would look the police agents in the eye and laugh, knowing they couldn't touch a hair on his head without the Tsar's permission. The press was censored, forbidden from printing his name, but the silence only made the rumours louder. People began to whisper that the Empress was German, Rasputin was her lover, and together they were plotting to destroy Russia from the inside. The Holy Friend had become a cancer, eating away at the dignity of the Romanov name, and the aristocracy began to realise that if the Tsar wouldn't get rid of the mad monk, they might have to take matters into their own hands. The tension in St. Petersburg was becoming unbearable, a powder keg waiting for a spark, and Rasputin was happily dancing on top of it, drunk on power and wine, oblivious to the knives being sharpened in the shadows. By 1911, the situation had mutated from a scandalous embarrassment into a full-blown constitutional crisis, because Grigori Rasputin decided that being the spiritual guru to the Empress wasn't enough. He wanted to run the Russian Empire. This is the moment when the mad monk crossed the line from being a court jester to becoming the Shadow Emperor, and the establishment decided to fight back with everything they had. The first major counterattack came from the very people who had helped him rise, the Orthodox Church. Bishop Hermogen and the firebrand monk Iliador, who had once been Rasputin's closest allies and had championed him as a saint, finally realised they had invited a demon into the sanctuary. They were horrified by the stories of his sexual exploits and his blasphemous twisting of scripture, so they staged an intervention that looked more like an exorcism. They lured Rasputin into a room, locked the door, and confronted him with a heavy crucifix, screaming at him to repent for his sins. The scene was chaotic and violent. Iliador reportedly struck Rasputin with the cross, spitting in his face and demanding he leave the capital forever, while Rasputin cowered and begged for mercy. But the moment he escaped the room, the tables turned instantly. Rasputin went straight to the Tsar and Tsarina, playing the victim, claiming that the envious church leaders were trying to destroy a true man of God. The result was terrifyingly swift. It wasn't Rasputin who was punished, but the high-ranking bishop and the famous monk who were banished into exile by order of the emperor. The message to the rest of Russia was clear and chilling. The peasant was more powerful than the church itself. But there was one man left who still had the courage to stand up to the Siberian usurper, and that was Pyotr Stolypin, the prime minister and the most capable politician Russia had produced in a century. Stolypin saw Rasputin not just as a disgrace, but as a genuine threat to national security, a loophole through which chaos was entering the state machinery. He ordered a comprehensive investigation into Rasputin's activities, compiling a dossier that proved his sectarian connections and his immoral behaviour, and he presented this damning evidence to the Tsar, demanding Rasputin be sent back to Siberia. Nicholas II looked at the report, looked at his most loyal minister and simply said, "There is nothing I can do." It was a moment of pathetic weakness that sealed the fate of the dynasty. Rasputin, realising Stolypin was his only real enemy, began to prophesy his doom, muttering to the Empress that death is riding on his carriage. In September 1911, while attending a gala at the Kiev Opera House with the Tsar, Stolypin was shot twice in the chest by an assassin in front of the horrified court. Rasputin wasn't there, but his shadow loomed over the tragedy. Many believed his prophecy was more of a curse, or perhaps he just knew that with Stolypin dead, there was no one left to stop him. With the Iron Prime Minister in the grave, the floodgates opened. Rasputin began to exert influence over political appointments, realising that he could make or break careers with a whisper in Alexandra's ear. Bureaucrats, generals, and ambitious socialites realised that the path to promotion didn't lie in hard work or merit, but in tea and cakes at Rasputin's apartment. If you wanted to be a minister, you didn't appeal to the parliament. You appealed to the illiterate peasant who could barely sign his own name. The press, which had been stifled by censorship, began to find creative ways to attack him, referring to him as the Dark Force, or the Unnamed One, printing cartoons of a giant bearded puppet master pulling the strings of the tiny royals. The mystique of the Romanovs was shattering. They were no longer seen as God's anointed rulers, but as the dupes of a charlatan. The public began to believe that the Empress was physically sleeping with Rasputin, and by extension, that the Russian throne itself had been defiled. The rot had set in deep, and while the aristocracy fumed in their palaces, the common people began to lose their reverence for the Tsar, seeing him not as a father figure, but as a weakling controlled by a dark magician. The groundwork for revolution was being laid, not by Bolsheviks in cellars, but by the holy man in the palace. If there was ever a moment that sealed the doom of the Russian Empire, it happened far away from the capital, in the remote hunting lodge of Spala in Poland, during the autumn of 1912, an event that historians call the Spala Crisis. This was the turning point where faith turned into fanaticism for the Empress. The royal family had travelled there for a relaxing retreat, desperate to escape the toxic atmosphere of St. Petersburg and the rumours surrounding Rasputin, who had been temporarily pressured into returning to Siberia to let the heat die down. But tragedy struck when the young Tsarevich Alexei, then only 8 years old, took a rough carriage ride that jostled his leg, causing a massive internal hemorrhage in his upper thigh. The haemophilia turned a minor bruise into a death sentence. A hematoma the size of a grapefruit formed. The pain was excruciating, and the boy's leg drew up against his chest, locking in a rigid, agonizing contraction. For days the heir to the throne screamed in agony, his cries echoing through the wooden lodge, tormenting his parents who stood by helplessly. The best doctors in the empire were flown in, but they could do absolutely nothing except watch the boy fade. His temperature spiked, infection set in, and his pulse grew thready and weak. The situation was so dire that the Tsar authorized the release of official medical bulletins, effectively preparing the Russian people for the death of their future emperor, and the last rites were administered as the boy drifted into delirium. Alexandra was in a state of catatonic shock, her mind fracturing under the grief, convinced that God was punishing her. In her darkest hour, she didn't turn to the doctors or the priests in the room. She sent a desperate telegram to the one man she believed could challenge death itself, Grigori Rasputin in Siberia. The reply that came back over the wires has become legendary. Rasputin didn't rush to Poland. He didn't even leave his village. He simply wired back, "God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. Do not let the doctors bother him too much." It seemed like the raving of a madman, telling a mother not to worry when her son was on his deathbed. But what happened next defied all logic. Within hours of the telegram arriving, the bleeding stopped. The boy's fever broke, the pain subsided, and he fell into a natural healing sleep. The doctors were dumbfounded, unable to offer any medical explanation for the spontaneous recovery. But for Alexandra, no explanation was needed. The telegram was proof absolute, written in the ink of divine intervention, that Grigori Rasputin was a living saint. From that moment on, Rasputin was invincible. Any doubt the Tsar might have had, any hesitation about the peasant's scandalous behaviour vanished completely. They believed that Rasputin literally held their son's life in his hands, that a spiritual umbilical cord connected the holy man to the prince, and if that cord was severed, the boy would die. This belief gave Rasputin a power that no minister, general or grand duke could match. He returned to St. Petersburg not just as a friend, but as the saviour of the dynasty, untouchable and triumphant. But while the family celebrated the miracle, the political clouds were gathering. It was 1914, and the world was marching blindly toward the abyss of the Great War. Surprisingly, Rasputin was one of the few voices in Russia passionately opposed to the war. Despite his lack of education, he possessed a peasant's intuition about the cost of conflict. He warned the Tsar that war with Germany would mean the end of Russia and the end of the Romanovs, predicting a sea of blood that would drown the nation. He famously wired the Tsar, begging him not to mobilize, saying, "I see a terrible cloud over Russia, a lot of sorrow and no end to it. It is one of the great ironies of history that the mad monk, the villain of the story, was the only one trying to stop the catastrophe, while the rational politicians were eager for the fight. However, fate had a cruel twist in store. Just days before the war broke out, Rasputin was stabbed in the stomach by a deranged woman in Siberia, a rival religious fanatic named Kyonia Guseva. While he lay in a hospital bed fighting for his own life, unable to influence the Tsar, the hawks in the government pushed Nicholas II to declare war. By the time Rasputin recovered, the machinery of destruction was already in motion, the cannons were firing, and the Russia he tried to save was already hurtling toward its own funeral. The war would be the catalyst that transformed Rasputin's influence from a court scandal into a national tragedy, as the chaos of the battlefield created a vacuum of leadership that he was all too eager to fill. By 1915, the First World War had mutated from a patriotic crusade into a meat grinder that was chewing up the Russian army and spitting out corpses by the million, creating the perfect storm for Grigori Rasputin's final ascent to absolute power. The Russian forces were suffering catastrophic defeats, ammunition was running low, soldiers were fighting barefoot in the snow, and the morale of the nation was collapsing. In a moment of tragic hubris, Tsar Nicholas II made the single worst decision of his entire reign. He decided to leave the capital, fire his uncle from the position of commander-in-chief, and take personal command of the army at the front lines. His advisors begged him not to do it, warning him that if the army failed, the blame would fall directly on the Tsar's head, and more importantly, his departure would leave the government in the hands of the Empress. But Nicholas was determined to be a warrior king, so he boarded the imperial train and steamed away to the military headquarters in Mogilev, effectively abandoning the ship of state to the two people least capable of steering it, a German-born empress terrified of the world, and a Siberian peasant drunk on power. This created a bizarre political vacuum where the capital, now renamed Petrograd to sound less German, was ruled not by laws but by the hallucinations of the dark forces. With the Tsar away, Alexandra was technically the regent, but everyone knew that she didn't sign a single document without the approval of our friend. Rasputin moved from being a spiritual advisor to being the de facto autocrat of the Russian Empire. He began a period of political chaos that historians famously call the ministerial leapfrog. Ministers were hired and fired at a dizzying pace, not based on their competence or their ability to run a war effort, but solely on their loyalty to Rasputin. If a minister refused to kiss Rasputin's hand or blocked his requests, Rasputin would tell Alexandra that the man had bad vibes, or was spiritually dark, and the Empress would bombard her husband with hysterical letters demanding the man's dismissal until the Tsar finally gave in just to get some peace. Competent, patriotic men were thrown out of office and replaced by sycophants, elderly incompetents, and corrupt bureaucrats whose only qualification was that they liked Rasputin. The most notorious appointment was Boris Sturmer, a man widely regarded as a German sympathizer and a fool, whom Rasputin elevated to prime minister simply because Sturmer flattered him. The government became a tragic joke. Access to the highest levels of power was now sold at Rasputin's apartment on Gorokovaya Street. If you wanted a promotion, a railroad contract, or an exemption from military service for your son, you didn't go to the ministry. You went to Rasputin with a basket of wine or a stack of rubles. He would scribble barely legible notes on scraps of paper, things like, "Do this for the pretty one, Grigori," and these scraps of paper became more powerful than imperial decrees. The aristocracy watched in horror as the empire was dismantled by a man they considered a filthy heretic. But it wasn't just incompetence that terrified the people, it was the spectre of treason. Because Alexandra was German by birth and refused to speak Russian in private, and because Rasputin had opposed the war, a dark rumour began to spread through the freezing breadlines of Petrograd. There was a German spy ring right at the top. People whispered that the Empress and Rasputin were secretly working for the Kaiser, sending military secrets to Berlin to ensure a Russian defeat. There is no historical evidence that they were actually spies, but in the fevered atmosphere of 1916, perception was reality. Soldiers dying in the trenches believed they were being betrayed by the German woman and her lover in the palace. The moral authority of the Romanovs evaporated completely. The Tsar was seen as a weak cuckold, the Empress as a traitor, and Rasputin as the devil pulling the strings. The city was starving, inflation was skyrocketing, and while the people froze, stories circulated of Rasputin's lavish orgies and his drunken boasts that the old woman, the Empress, did whatever he told her. The situation had passed the point of no return. The ruling class realised that the Tsar was too weak to save himself, so if Russia was to survive, Rasputin had to die. The whispers in the salons turned into concrete plans, and the hunt for the mad monk began in earnest. By the freezing December of 1916, the talk of murder had moved from whispered rumours to concrete tactical planning, spearheaded by a man who seemed an unlikely assassin, but was driven by a fanaticism that rivaled Rasputin's own. Prince Felix Yusupov was the wealthiest man in Russia, arguably richer than the Tsar himself, a flamboyant, Oxford-educated aristocrat known for his cross-dressing, his bisexuality, and his morbid fascination with death. To the outside world, he was a spoiled dandy living in the Moika Palace, a place of unimaginable opulence. But inside, he was burning with a patriot's rage. He believed quite literally that Rasputin was the Antichrist, a demonic force sent to drag Holy Russia into the abyss, and he decided that he had been chosen by God to slay the beast. But Yusupov knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed legitimacy to ensure the people saw this not as a crime, but as an act of justice. He recruited a strange coalition of conspirators that represented the full spectrum of the Russian elite. First, there was Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's first cousin, and a favourite of the court, whose royal blood would provide a shield against prosecution. Then there was Vladimir Purishkevich, a loud right-wing politician known for his anti-Semitic rants and his fierce loyalty to the monarchy, proving that hatred for Rasputin was the only thing that could unite the liberals and the conservatives. Together with a doctor named Stanislaus Lasevert and an army officer named Sukhotin, they devised a plan that read like a cheap melodrama. They knew they couldn't just shoot Rasputin in the street because he was guarded by the secret police. They had to lure him into a trap, a place where he would feel safe enough to drop his guard. Yusupov knew Rasputin's fatal weakness was his insatiable lust for high-born women, so he decided to use his own wife, the stunningly beautiful Princess Irina, the Tsar's niece, as the bait. Rasputin had long been obsessed with meeting Irina, and Yusupov sent word to the holy man that the princess would be entertaining guests at the Moika Palace on the night of December 16th, and wished to meet him privately. It was a lie. Irina wasn't even in the city, but Rasputin, blinded by his own vanity and desire, swallowed the hook. What makes this story truly chilling is that Rasputin seemed to know the end was coming. In the weeks leading up to that night, he became moody and paranoid, drinking heavily and muttering about his impending death. He reportedly went to his bank and withdrew his savings to give to his daughter, telling her that his time was short. But the most terrifying piece of evidence is a letter he allegedly wrote to the Tsar just days before the murder, a document that serves as a prophecy from the grave. In it he wrote, "I feel that I shall leave life before January 1st. If I am killed by common assassins, you, Tsar of Russia, have nothing to fear for your children. But if I am murdered by your relations, by the nobles, then no one of your family, none of your children or relations, will remain alive for more than 2 years. They will be killed by the Russian people." It was a curse of biblical proportions, tying his lifeblood to the survival of the dynasty. Whether the letter is authentic or a later forgery remains a subject of debate, but the sentiment was real. Rasputin knew the wolves were circling. On the night of the 16th, he put on his finest silk shirt, combed his greasy hair, and scented his beard, preparing for a romantic rendezvous with a princess. He told his servants he was going to visit the little one, his nickname for Yusupov, unaware that he was dressing for his own funeral. The conspirators were waiting in the basement of the Moika Palace, which they had transformed into a cosy dining room, soundproofed and filled with sweet cakes and wine. But the cakes were laced with enough potassium cyanide to kill a cavalry regiment. The trap was set, the executioners were nervous, and the victim was on his way. The most bizarre and gruesome night in Russian history was about to begin. It was shortly after midnight when Prince Yusupov arrived at the dark apartment building to collect his prey, finding Rasputin dressed in a silk shirt embroidered with cornflowers, smelling of cheap soap and heavy perfume. The drive to the Moika Palace was tense, the silence of the snowy streets broken only by Rasputin's rambling questions about the princess, unaware that the woman he desired was miles away in the Crimea. Yusupov led the monk down a winding spiral staircase into the basement, a room that had been meticulously staged to look like a cosy bachelor's hideaway, filled with antique furniture, rugs, and a fire crackling in the grate to ward off the damp chill of the Neva River. On the table sat the deadly buffet, plates of Rasputin's favourite cream cakes, laced with enough cyanide to kill a herd of oxen, and crystal glasses filled with poison Madeira wine. The other conspirators waited upstairs, listening through the floorboards, their hearts pounding in their chests. At first, Rasputin was suspicious, refusing the food and drink, pacing the room like a caged animal sensing a trap, and for a terrifying moment, Yusupov thought the plan had failed before it even started. But the allure of the sweet wine and the cakes was too strong for the gluttonous monk. He eventually sat down and reached for a cake. Yusupov watched in frozen fascination as Rasputin put the poisoned pastry into his mouth and swallowed it. The prince waited for the convulsions, the gasp for air, the instant death that the doctor had promised, but nothing happened. Rasputin simply chewed, swallowed, and reached for another one. He ate a second cake, then a third. He washed them down with a glass of the poisoned wine. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare. The cyanide, which should have stopped his heart in seconds, seemed to have absolutely no effect on him. Rasputin didn't scream. He didn't collapse. He just wiped the crumbs from his beard and complained that his throat felt a little scratchy. Panic began to claw at Yusupov's sanity. Was this man actually human? Was he really protected by Satan, as the rumours claimed? The minutes turned into hours. Rasputin, fueled by the toxic mixture, became more animated, asking Yusupov to play the guitar and sing gypsy songs for him. Imagine the horror of the situation. A young prince strumming a guitar and singing cheerful songs while his guest, who should have been a corpse an hour ago, sat across from him, smiling, drinking poison like it was water. The air in the basement grew thick and suffocating. Rasputin's eyes, usually piercing, became glazed and heavy, but not with death, just with drunkenness. He began to slur his words, talking about the future of Russia, about the Empress, completely oblivious to the fact that he was currently digesting a lethal chemical cocktail. Upstairs, the other conspirators were losing their minds. They heard the voices, the music, the laughter, but no thud of a falling body. They had expected a quick, clean assassination, but they were trapped in a supernatural standoff. Yusupov, sweating and trembling, realised that poison wasn't going to work. The mad monk was proving to be chemically indestructible. Historical theories abound as to why. Maybe the sugar in the cakes neutralised the cyanide, maybe the chemical was old, or maybe Rasputin's chronic alcoholism had altered his stomach lining. But in that dimly lit cellar there was no room for science, only terror. Yusupov couldn't take it anymore. He told Rasputin he needed to go upstairs to check on the guests, leaving the monster alone in the basement. He rushed up the stairs to his friends, pale as a ghost, gasping, "He won't die! The poison isn't working!" The plan had disintegrated. They had to make a choice, abandon the mission and flee the country, or go back down there and finish the job with something louder and messier than poison. They chose violence. Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich, his face pale and set in a grim mask of determination, pulled a heavy Browning revolver from his pocket and pressed it into Yusupov's trembling hand, the cold steel offering a final, brutal solution to a problem that defied all natural laws. Yusupov took the weapon, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, and turned to face the spiral staircase that led back down into the abyss. Walking down those steps for the second time was a journey into madness. The silence of the basement felt heavy, oppressive, as if the air itself was thickening to protect the monster waiting below. When Yusupov entered the room, he found Rasputin sitting in a chair, his head slumped forward, breathing heavily, his chest heaving as his supernatural constitution fought a war against the lethal dose of cyanide coursing through his veins. The monk looked up, his eyes glazed and confused, struggling to focus on the prince, and mumbled something incoherent about the wine burning his stomach, completely unaware that he was staring at his executioner. A wave of revulsion and terror washed over Yusupov. He couldn't understand how a human being could consume enough poison to kill a platoon and still be asking for more wine. The prince knew he had to end it now, before the monk's hypnotic gaze could paralyze him again. He pointed to a magnificent crystal crucifix that stood on a cabinet near the wall, and said, with a voice that he barely recognized as his own, "Grigori Yefimovich, you'd better look at the crucifix and say a prayer." It was a classic line, a final mercy, giving the condemned man a moment to make peace with God. Rasputin stumbled to his feet, swaying like a drunkard, and walked slowly toward the cross, staring at it with a mix of fascination and fear, perhaps finally sensing the angel of death in the room. As the monk gazed into the crystal, Yusupov raised the revolver, aiming for the centre of the chest, right where the heart should be. He squeezed the trigger. The deafening roar of the gunshot shattered the silence of the palace, echoing off the stone walls like a cannon blast. Rasputin let out a guttural roar, his hands clawing at the air, and collapsed backward onto the white bearskin rug, blood beginning to stain the pristine fur a dark crimson red. The tension in the room snapped. Hearing the shot, the other conspirators, Grand Duke Dmitri, Purishkevich, and Dr. Lazovert, came thundering down the stairs, their faces flushed with a mix of panic and triumph. They crowded around the fallen giant, their breath visible in the cold air. The doctor knelt beside the body, searching for a pulse, checking the pupil response, performing the clinical rituals of death. After a tense moment, he looked up and nodded solemnly. The bullet has passed through the region of the heart. He is dead. A collective sigh of relief swept through the group. The nightmare was finally over, the beast was slain, and Russia was saved. They turned off the lights, leaving the corpse in the darkness of the cellar, and retreated upstairs to the study to celebrate their victory and plan the disposal of the body. But Prince Yusupov could not find peace. A strange, gnawing anxiety began to eat away at him, an inexplicable feeling that something was wrong, that it couldn't possibly be this easy. While his friends discussed alibis and transport, Yusupov felt a magnetic pull drawing him back to the basement, a morbid curiosity he couldn't resist. He excused himself and crept back down the stairs, the darkness below seeming to swirl and shift. He entered the room and approached the body lying on the rug. Rasputin was exactly where they had left him, a motionless heap of velvet and blood. Yusupov bent down, shaking the body, checking for any sign of life, but there was nothing, no breath, no heartbeat, just the stillness of death. Satisfied, or so he thought, he turned to leave. But then, in the corner of his eye, he saw it. The left eyelid of the corpse began to twitch. Yusupov froze, his blood turning to ice. He watched in paralyzed horror as the eye slowly, deliberately peeled open. Then the other eye opened. They weren't the glassy eyes of a dead man. They were the green, viper-like eyes of Rasputin, burning with an intense demonic hatred. Before Yusupov could scream, The corpse sprang to life with the speed of a striking cobra. Rasputin lunged upward, his powerful hands clamping around Yusupov's throat in a death grip, his fingers digging into the flesh like iron claws. Foam was bubbling from the monk's mouth, and he let out a low, inhuman growl, screaming, "Felix, Felix, I will tell the Empress everything." It was a scene of absolute Gothic horror. The man who had been poisoned and shot through the heart was now strangling his killer, fueled by a rage that transcended death itself. Yusupov, in a frenzy of pure survival instinct, fought back, tearing himself away from the monk's grip, ripping the epaulette off his uniform in the struggle. He shoved the monster away and scrambled up the stairs, screaming for help, screaming that the devil himself was alive in the basement. Behind him, he heard the heavy, thumping sound of Rasputin crawling on all fours, dragging his broken body up the steps, relentlessly pursuing him like a creature from a nightmare. The mad monk was not just hard to kill, he was refusing to die, breaking through the heavy oak door at the top of the stairs and stumbling out into the snowy courtyard, determined to escape and bring his vengeance down upon them all. Panic erupted in the study as Prince Yusupov, pale and gasping for breath, collided with Vladimir Purishkevich, shouting that the poison had failed, the bullet to the heart had failed, and the mad monk was currently escaping into the night to bring the wrath of the entire Russian Empire down upon their heads. Purishkevich, the hardened right-wing politician who had spent his life fighting verbal battles in the Duma, now found himself facing a literal monster. He drew his savage pistol and sprinted out into the courtyard, where a scene of surreal horror awaited him. The heavy oak door leading to the garden was smashed open, splinters of wood scattered across the snow, and there, wading through the deep drifts towards the iron gate that led to the street, was Grigori Rasputin. The man was a ruin, poisoned and shot, yet he was moving with a terrifying animalistic determination, screaming into the darkness, "Felix, Felix, I will tell everything to the Empress." His voice wasn't weak. It was a booming roar that threatened to wake the entire neighbourhood and alert the policemen stationed nearby. Purishkevich knew that if Rasputin reached that gate, the game was over. They would be arrested, executed for treason, and the Romanov dynasty would be doomed. He raised his pistol, his hand shaking in the biting cold, and fired. The first shot cracked through the night air, kicking up a spray of snow near Rasputin's feet, but the monk didn't stop. Purishkevich fired again, and again he missed. The stress and the sheer impossibility of the situation destroying his aim. He cursed himself, terrified that he was missing a target at such close range, and in a moment of bizarre clarity, he actually bit his own hand hard enough to draw blood, using the sharp pain to snap his mind back into focus. He steadied his breathing, aimed carefully at the retreating back of the giant, and squeezed the trigger for a third time. This time the bullet found its mark, slamming into Rasputin's shoulders and spinning him around, but incredibly the man still tried to stand, still tried to crawl. Purishkevich didn't hesitate. He closed the distance, walking right up to the fallen figure who was groaning and gnashing his teeth in the snow, and fired a fourth and final shot directly into Rasputin's forehead. The bullet entered the temple, finally severing the connection between the brain and the body that refused to die. Rasputin convulsed once and then collapsed into the snowbank, silent at last. The nightmare should have ended there, but the violence of the night had driven the conspirators into a state of temporary insanity. Yusupov, hearing the shot stop, ran into the courtyard and saw his enemy lying dead. Instead of relief, he was overcome by a wave of hysterical rage. He grabbed a heavy rubber dumbbell, some accounts say a truncheon, and began to savagely beat the corpse, striking the face and chest over and over again in a frenzy, terrified that the eyes might open one more time. The other conspirators had to physically drag the prince away from the body, fearing he would lose his mind completely. They quickly wrapped the battered, bloody body in a heavy blue curtain and bound it with a rope, creating a makeshift shroud for the man who had once ruled Russia. But the chaos continued. In their haste and panic, they forgot to attach the heavy chains and weights they had bought specifically to sink the body. They hauled the corpse into Perishkovich's open-top car and drove wildly through the sleeping streets of Petrograd, heading for the Petrovsky Bridge. The city was silent, buried under a thick blanket of winter fog as the murderers raced toward the Neva River. When they reached the bridge, they found the hole in the ice that had been prepared earlier, but the disposal was clumsy and rushed. They didn't gently slide the body in. They practically threw it over the railing, watching it splash into the dark, freezing water below. In their panic, they left behind a damning piece of evidence. One of Rasputin's galoshes, a heavy rubber boot, had fallen off during the struggle and was lying plainly on the bridge piling, along with ominous smears of blood on the railing. They didn't notice it in the dark. They believed the river would sweep the body out to the Gulf of Finland, that the mad monk would vanish forever, leaving no trace, and that the Tsar and Tsarina would simply believe he had returned to Siberia. They drove away, exhausted, trembling, and covered in blood, believing they had just saved the country. But Grigori Rasputin had one final surprise left for them, a twist that would turn their clumsy assassination into a public spectacle. As the icy water of the Neva closed over his head, the legend of his immortality was about to be cemented forever, because when the body would eventually be found, the autopsy results would reveal details so shocking that they would fuel 100 years of conspiracy theories. The conspirators went home to wash the blood from their hands, unaware that they hadn't just killed a man. They had created a martyr, and the dawn would bring not salvation, but a storm that would tear the empire apart. The sun rose over the frozen Neva River on the morning of December the 17th, illuminating a scene that would instantly unravel the clumsy cover-up attempted by Prince Yusupov and his accomplices, proving that while they might have been aristocrats, they were terrible criminals. A river policeman patrolling the Petrovsky Bridge noticed something that didn't belong: a large smear of blood on the railing, and resting on one of the bridge pilings below, a single, lonely rubber galoche. It was a size 10 boot, the kind worn by a large man, and inside was the name of the manufacturer, and a size marking that the police quickly traced back to the apartment on Gorokovaya Street. The investigation didn't take weeks. It took hours. Minister of the Interior Protopopov, a devoted follower of Rasputin who had been placed in power by the monk's influence, immediately sensed that the dark forces had finally struck. He ordered a massive manhunt, and when the police questioned the servants at the Moika Palace, the story of the shot dog fell apart instantly, because the blood in the courtyard was far too copious to belong to a canine, and human blood was found on the snow. While Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitri tried to feign ignorance, claiming Rasputin had left the party alive, the Empress Alexandra knew the truth in her bones. She collapsed into a state of hysterical grief, screaming that our friend had been murdered by her own relatives, and she demanded that the river be dragged immediately. For 3 agonizing days, divers braved the biting cold of the Neva, cutting holes in the thick ice, searching the murky depths for the man who had held the empire together. Finally, on December 19th, they saw a coat trapped under a sheet of ice near the bridge. When they hauled the body to the surface, the sight was gruesome enough to haunt them for the rest of their lives. Rasputin's body was frozen in a contorted position, his arms raised as if he had been fighting against the ice, his face a battered mask of frozen blood and bruised flesh. But it was the details revealed during the autopsy by Professor Kosorotov that would cement the legend of the immortal monk and send a chill down the spine of the entire nation. The autopsy took place in a desolate military hospital under the cover of night, and the findings were baffling. The doctor found 3 bullet wounds, one in the chest, one in the back, and the final fatal shot in the forehead. He also found severe trauma to the face, consistent with being beaten by a heavy object, confirming Yusupov's dumbbell rage. But the most shocking revelation, the detail that has been debated by historians and pathologists for over a century, was the condition of his lungs. The autopsy report stated that there was water in Rasputin's lungs. In forensic science, this typically implies that the victim was still alive when they entered the water, meaning that after being poisoned with enough cyanide to kill an elephant, shot 3 times at point-blank range and beaten with a metal bar, Grigori Rasputin was likely still breathing when he was thrown into the freezing river. He had fought for life until the very last second, possibly trying to claw his way out from under the ice before the cold finally stopped his heart. Furthermore, his right hand was found frozen in a peculiar position, with 3 fingers brought together as if he were making the sign of the cross, a final act of defiance or prayer in his dying moments. The news of the autopsy leaked instantly, and the people of Russia were terrified. If bullets and poison couldn't kill him, what was he? Was he truly a demon? Or was he a saint whose martyrdom would bring down the wrath of God? The Empress was inconsolable. She ordered a secret funeral to be held in the park of the Tsarskoye Selo Palace, a small, sombre affair attended only by the royal family and a few loyal servants. They buried him in a spot where Alexandra planned to build a mausoleum, placing an icon on his chest signed by the Empress and her daughters. As the coffin was lowered into the frozen ground, Nicholas II stood weeping, a broken man who knew he had lost his spiritual anchor. He wanted to execute the murderers, to hang Yusupov and Dmitri for their crime, but the pressure from the extended Romanov family was immense. Every Grand Duke and Duchess in the family wrote to the Tsar, begging for leniency, arguing that the murder was a patriotic act committed to save the monarchy. Nicholas, in his typical weakness, caved. Instead of a trial and execution, he simply exiled the killers, Yusupov to his country estate and Dmitri to the Persian front. It was a slap on the wrist for a cold-blooded murder, and it sent a fatal message to the Russian people: there was no law for the rich. But as the dirt covered Rasputin's coffin, his final prophecy began to tick like a doomsday clock. He had warned that if he was killed by the nobles, the Tsar would lose his throne and his life within 2 years. The date was December 1916. The countdown to the apocalypse had begun, and without the mad monk to deflect the hatred of the masses, the Romanovs were now standing alone against the gathering storm of the revolution, completely unprotected and utterly oblivious to the fact that their own time was running out. With the dark force buried under the frozen earth of the imperial park, the aristocracy of St. Petersburg breathed a collective sigh of relief, popping champagne corks in their salons and toasting to a new era of freedom, believing that the cancer had been cut out and the patient would magically recover. But they were suffering from a fatal delusion, because Grigori Rasputin wasn't the disease. He was merely the most visible symptom of a rot that had infected the entire system. They expected the Tsar to suddenly wake up, to become a strong, decisive leader, now that the hypnotic spell was broken, but instead, the exact opposite happened. The murder of Rasputin didn't save the monarchy. It destroyed the last psychological defence the Tsar had. Nicholas II plunged into a deep, apathetic depression, feeling that he was surrounded by traitors in his own family, while the Empress Alexandra completely detached from reality. She didn't treat Rasputin's death as a liberation. She treated it as a martyrdom. She spent hours every day praying at his fresh grave, convinced that his spirit was still guiding her, telling her to be ruthless, to crush the opposition, and to trust no one but the spirit of the friend. She began to surround herself with an even stranger cast of characters, trying to fill the void Rasputin left with mediums and charlatans who promised to channel his ghost. The government was paralysed because the Empress refused to work with any minister who had not been approved by Rasputin when he was alive, turning the administration of the empire into a ghost ship steered by a dead man. But the most dangerous consequence of the murder was something the assassins had never predicted: the removal of the scapegoat. For years, every mistake, every military defeat, and every food shortage was blamed on the German woman and the mad monk, allowing the people to maintain a sliver of love for the Tsar himself, thinking, the Tsar is good, he is just being tricked. But now, the monk was dead, the evil advisor was gone. So when the bread didn't appear in the shops, and the soldiers continued to die in the trenches, the people could no longer blame the dark forces. They had to blame the Tsar directly. The lightning rod had been removed, and Nicholas II was now standing naked before the gathering storm. January and February of 1917 brought a winter of biblical severity to Russia. The temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below zero, freezing the railway lines and paralysing the transport of grain and fuel. In Petrograd, the situation became apocalyptic. Women stood in line for 40 hours in the freezing cold just to buy a single loaf of bread, wrapping their children in rags to keep them from freezing to death, while rumours spread that the rich were still feasting on caviar and champagne in their warm palaces. The anger in the bread lines turned from grumbling into a revolutionary fervour. The police reports from this time are terrifying. They describe a population that had lost all fear of authority, a city that was a powder keg waiting for a single spark. That spark came in late February, not from a mastermind revolutionary plan, but from the simple, primal desperation of starving women. On International Women's Day, thousands of female textile workers walked out of their factories, not with guns, but with empty pots and pans, banging them together and screaming, "Bread! Give us bread!" It was a sound that would topple an empire. They marched onto the frozen Nevsky Prospect, and instead of being dispersed, they were joined by men from the metal factories, then by students, and finally by the very people paid to stop them, the Cossacks. In previous years, the Cossacks would have whipped the crowd into submission, but this time something changed. The soldiers looked at the starving women and saw their own wives and mothers. They lowered their whips. They winked at the protesters. The bond of loyalty that held the autocracy together snapped in that moment. The Tsar, who was away at the military headquarters at the front, received telegrams warning him that the capital was in chaos, but he dismissed them as nonsense from a fat panic monger, refusing to believe that his people were rising against him. He was still living in the bubble Rasputin had helped create, a bubble where the Tsar was the beloved father of the nation. But the reality was that the streets of Petrograd were burning, the police stations were being sacked, and the prisons were being thrown open. The revolution that Rasputin had prophesied, the sea of blood that would drown the nobles who killed him, had arrived ahead of schedule. The ghost of the mad monk seemed to be laughing from the grave as the Romanov dynasty, which had stood for 300 years, began to crumble in a matter of days, brought down not by a foreign army, but by the hunger and rage of the very peasants Rasputin had claimed to represent. The prophecy was entering its final lethal phase. The prophecy of the mad monk had now entered its terminal velocity, crashing into the reality of 1917 with the force of a freight train. While Nicholas II sat trapped in his imperial train car at Pskov, cut off from his capital by rebellious railway workers who refused to let the emperor pass, the realization finally hit him that the peasant from Siberia had been the only thing holding the dam against the flood. On March 2nd, isolated, betrayed by his generals, and seeing his empire dissolving into anarchy, Nicholas II did the unthinkable. He signed the instrument of abdication. With a few strokes of a pencil, the 300-year reign of the Romanov dynasty was extinguished, not with a bang, but with a whimper. The Tsar resigned as if he were simply handing over command of a squadron, handing the throne to his brother who promptly refused it, leaving Russia a republic. It had been exactly 73 days since the murder of Rasputin. The prophecy was fulfilled with terrifying mathematical precision. If I die or you desert me, in 6 months you will lose your son and your throne. Rasputin had given them 6 months. Fate only gave them 3. But for the frenzied mob in Petrograd, destroying the monarchy wasn't enough. They wanted to destroy the memory of the dark forces that had tormented them. The hatred for Rasputin was so intense that it transcended death itself. The revolutionaries, drunk on their newfound power and eager to erase every trace of the old regime, marched to the Alexander Park at Tsarskoye Selo, hunting for the secret grave of the Holy Devil. They found the mound of earth near the proposed mausoleum, and with a macabre enthusiasm, they dug up the coffin. It was a chaotic scene, a mob of soldiers and workers desecrating a grave, expecting to find gold or jewels, but finding only the rotting corpse of the man who had slept in the Tsar's palace. They hauled the heavy metal casket onto a truck, intending to transport it to a secret location to destroy it once and for all, fearful that if they left it, it would become a shrine for loyalists or cultists. The truck broke down on the Lesnoy Road in the middle of a snowy forest, and the mob, impatient and superstitious, decided to finish the job right there. They built a massive pyre of pine logs, soaked it in gasoline, and dragged Rasputin's body out of the coffin. What happened next is perhaps the most terrifying urban legend of the revolution, yet it is grounded in gruesome biological reality. As the flames roared higher, consuming the frozen, decomposing flesh of the monk, the heat caused the tendons in his legs and waist to contract violently. To the horrified soldiers standing around the fire, watching with bated breath, it looked as if the corpse was coming back to life one last time. Rasputin's body slowly curled upward, appearing to sit up in the flames, his burning arm moving as if to wave or point a finger of accusation at his tormentors. Panic erupted in the clearing. Men screamed, "He is alive! He is rising!" And some reportedly fled into the woods, terrified that the demon was immune to fire just as he had been immune to poison. It was the final grotesque performance of the great manipulator, terrorizing his enemies even as he was being reduced to ash. The soldiers poked the body with sticks, beating it back down into the inferno until there was nothing left but a pile of grey dust. But even the wind seemed to conspire with the legend. The ashes were scattered, blown across the snowy landscape of the Russia he had predicted would be destroyed. The irony was suffocating. The aristocrats had killed Rasputin to save the empire, but his murder had been the final nail in its coffin, and now his ashes were mixing with the soil of a land that was about to be drenched in the blood of the civil war. Meanwhile, back at the palace, the former Tsar and Tsarina were placed under house arrest, stripped of their titles, and referred to simply as Citizen Romanov and his wife. Alexandra was devastated, not just by the loss of the throne, but by the news of the desecration of our friend's grave. She took it as the ultimate omen of doom. Without Rasputin's prayers to protect them, she believed they were naked before the wrath of God. The protection he had promised was gone, and the punishment he had predicted, that none of your children or relations will remain alive for more than 2 years, was now the only future they had left. The safety of the palace was an illusion. The guards at the gates were no longer saluting loyalists, but revolutionaries wearing red armbands, staring at the family with open hostility. The Romanovs were now prisoners in their own home, waiting for the next phase of the tragedy, while the spirit of the burned monk seemed to hang over the palace like a curse that could not be lifted. The mad monk was gone, but the madness he had unleashed was only just beginning. As the spring of 1917 melted the snow covering the ashes of the mad monk, the Romanov family found themselves trapped in a purgatory that was, in many ways, more cruel than death itself, a daily humiliation that seemed to confirm every dark warning Rasputin had ever whispered in the Empress's ear. Confined to the Alexander Palace, the former rulers of 1/6 of the earth were now at the mercy of the very soldiers who had once sworn to die for them. But the discipline of the army had evaporated, replaced by a toxic mixture of revolutionary zeal and crude disrespect. The guards, emboldened by the fall of the dynasty, took a sick pleasure in tormenting the family, and their favourite weapon was the memory of Rasputin. They would deliberately desecrate the privacy of the Grand Duchesses, whistling and making lewd gestures, but the psychological torture went deeper. They covered the palace walls and fences with pornographic graffiti and obscene cartoons depicting the Empress and Rasputin in acts of grotesque debauchery. Every time Alexandra looked out the window, she was forced to see the twisted fantasies of the mob, a constant reminder of the dark force scandal that had destroyed her reputation. The family was stripped of their dignity layer by layer. Their correspondence was read, their phone lines were cut, and they were forced to listen to the guards singing revolutionary anthems about hanging the Tsar all night long. Alexandra, broken and frail, retreated further into her religious mysticism, clutching the icons Rasputin had blessed, convinced that their suffering was a test from God, a penance for the sin of allowing our friend to be murdered. But the provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, knew that the Romanovs were a lightning rod for violence in the capital. The Petrograd Soviet was demanding their heads, and Kerensky, in a desperate bid to keep them alive, or perhaps just to get them out of the way, made the fateful decision to exile the family to the depths of Siberia. The destination was Tobolsk, a sleepy, frozen town in the middle of nowhere. The choice of location was deeply ironic, but the journey to get there provided one of the most spine-chilling coincidences in history, a moment so perfect that it feels like it was written by a novelist rather than dictated by fate. To reach Tobolsk, the family had to travel by steamship down the Tura River. As the boat, the Rus, chugged along the muddy waters on August 19th, it passed a tiny, insignificant village on the riverbank. That village was Pokrovskoye. The family stood on the deck, huddled together in their coats, and watched in silence as they passed the very house where Grigori Rasputin was born, the house where he had raised his family, and the house where he had first predicted their doom. Rasputin had once told the Empress, "You will see my village, but alas, you will not visit it," a cryptic statement that now revealed its terrifying meaning. They were seeing it as prisoners, sailing past it on their way to oblivion. Alexandra wept openly, making the sign of the cross, seeing this as the ultimate spiritual signal that their fates were inextricably bound to the peasant mystic. They arrived in Tobolsk and were installed in the former governor's mansion, a bleak, draughty house that smelled of neglect. At first, life was monotonous but bearable. They played cards, put on plays, and chopped wood for exercise, clinging to the hope that their English relatives would rescue them. But in November 1917, the world turned upside down again. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, seized power in Petrograd, overthrowing the provisional government. The moderate revolution was over. The radical, bloodthirsty revolution had begun. The news reached Tobolsk like a death knell. The polite guards were replaced by hardline Bolshevik fanatics, who saw the Romanovs not as humans, but as blood-drinking tyrants. The noose began to tighten. Their allowance was cut off, forcing them to dismiss faithful servants. Butter and coffee disappeared from the table. They were barred from going to church. The prophecy of the 2 years was ticking loudly. Rasputin had said that if the nobles killed him, brothers will kill brothers, and now the Russian Civil War was erupting, a chaotic bloodbath of red against white. The Tsar, once the autocrat of all the Russias, was now just a man reading newspapers about his own country's destruction, powerless to stop it. The Bolsheviks in Moscow began to debate what to do with citizen Romanov. A public trial was discussed, a show trial where Nicholas would be judged for the crimes of his reign. But the situation on the war front was getting desperate. White Army forces were closing in on Siberia, hoping to rescue the Tsar. The Bolsheviks realized that Tobolsk was too open, too comfortable, and too close to the rescue lines. They needed a place that was a fortress, a place where there would be no escape. In the spring of 1918, the order came to move the family to Yekaterinburg, a staunchly Bolshevik industrial city in the Urals, a place known for its hostility to the monarchy. As they packed their meagre belongings, Alexandra had a premonition of death. She carried with her a piece of the true cross given to her by Rasputin, believing it was the only shield she had left. They were leaving the purgatory of Tobolsk and heading straight into the gates of hell, and the ghost of the mad monk seemed to be leading the way, ushering them toward the basement that would become the most famous murder scene in human history. The destination was a sinister, 2-story stone mansion, ominously codenamed the House of Special Purpose, a title that left little to the imagination regarding the Bolsheviks' intentions, and it was here that the final act of the tragedy would play out in a claustrophobic atmosphere of doom. The house was owned by a merchant named Ipatiev, and here lies one of those historical coincidences that makes the hair on your arm stand up. A coincidence so perfect it feels like Rasputin himself orchestrated it from the afterlife to complete the circle of fate. The Romanov dynasty had begun exactly 305 years earlier, when Mikhail Romanov was offered the crown at the Ipatiev monastery, and now, by a twist of cruel destiny, the dynasty was destined to end at the Ipatiev house, a perfect tragic bookend to 3 centuries of rule. The family was immediately stripped of their privacy and their dignity. The Bolsheviks built a high wooden palisade around the house to block the view from the street, and they painted over the windows with thick white lime, creating a suffocating milk-white fog that prevented the prisoners from seeing the outside world and the world from seeing them. Inside this white tomb, the atmosphere was suffocating. The guards were no longer the undisciplined soldiers of Tobolsk, but hardened Cheka secret police agents who viewed the family as vermin. They ate the family's food, blew smoke in their faces, and drew obscene pictures of Rasputin and the Empress on the walls of the lavatory, forcing the young Grand Duchesses to see the mad monk depicted as a pornographic beast every time they used the bathroom. Despite this psychological torture, Alexandra remained fiercely devoted to the memory of her friend. She and the girls had sewn their most valuable diamonds and pearls into the lining of their corsets and undergarments, not just to hide them from the thieves guarding them, but to preserve some capital for the life they still naively believed awaited them in exile. They were literally wearing their fortune as armour, a detail that would have gruesome consequences in the final moments. The clock was winding down. It was July 1918, and the sound of artillery fire could be heard in the distance. The White Army, accompanied by the Czech Legion, was closing in on Yekaterinburg, determined to liberate the Tsar. This rescue attempt was the trigger the Bolsheviks had been waiting for. In Moscow, Lenin and his ruthless enforcer Yakov Sverdlov realized that a living Tsar, even a deposed one, was a dangerous symbol that could rally the anti-communist forces. They decided that the Romanovs could not be allowed to fall into white hands. The order was given: liquidate the entire family. There would be no trial, no public judgment, just a cold-blooded execution in the middle of the night. The man chosen to carry out this grim task was Yakov Yurovsky, a watchmaker turned revolutionary who possessed the cold, detached efficiency of a machine. On the night of July 16th, Yurovsky received the final confirmation. He instructed the kitchen boy to send away the scullery lad, sparing his life, and began to distribute revolvers to his squad of executioners. It was past midnight when he woke the family, telling them a lie that was both plausible and terrifying. He told them that the White Army was attacking the city and that there was chaos in the streets, so for their own safety, they needed to be moved to the basement while transport was arranged. The family, groggy and confused, dressed quickly. Nicholas carried his sickly son Alexei in his arms, the boy still unable to walk due to a recent haemophilia attack, while Alexandra and the 4 girls, Olga, Tatiana, Maria and Anastasia, followed behind, clutching their pillows and small bags, completely unaware that they were walking to their graves. They were led down a flight of narrow stairs into a small semi-basement room with a vaulted ceiling and barred windows. It was an empty, barren space, a concrete box that felt like a dungeon. Alexandra, complaining that there were no chairs, asked if they could sit. Yurovsky ordered 2 chairs to be brought in, one for the Empress and one for the Tsarevich. The Tsar stood, shielding his family, while the girls stood behind their mother. They waited there for a few minutes, believing a truck was coming to take them away. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with the smell of damp plaster, and the unspoken fear that Rasputin's final prophecy, that they would not survive his death by 2 years, was about to come true. Then, the double doors swung open, and instead of a rescue team, Yurovsky marched in with a squad of 12 armed men blocking the exit. The House of Special Purpose had fulfilled its purpose. The room was suddenly very small, very crowded, and very deadly. Yakov Yurovsky stepped forward, a piece of paper in his hand, breaking the terrifying silence of the cellar with a voice that was cold and devoid of any humanity. He looked directly at the Tsar and read the death sentence. In view of the fact that your relatives are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you. The words hung in the air like toxic gas. Nicholas II, who had been expecting a transfer to another prison, was completely bewildered. He turned to look at his family, then turned back to Yurovsky and stammered, "What? What?" Hardly able to process the reality of what was happening, Yurovsky didn't repeat himself. He didn't offer an explanation. He simply shouted, "This!" and raised his Colt revolver, firing point blank into the Tsar's chest. That single shot was the signal for the apocalypse to begin. The room erupted into a deafening cacophony of gunfire as the 12 executioners unleashed a storm of bullets into the huddled group. Nicholas dropped instantly, dead before he hit the floor, but what followed was not a clean military execution. It was a chaotic, bloody massacre that descended into absolute madness. The room was tiny, and the stone walls caused the bullets to ricochet wildly, buzzing like angry hornets around the heads of the executioners themselves, forcing them to stop firing for a moment as the room filled with a thick, choking cloud of gunpowder smoke and pulverized plaster. Through the haze and the ringing in their ears, the gunmen heard something that made their blood run cold, the sound of weeping and low moans. As the smoke cleared, they saw a sight that defied all logic and terrified them to their core. The Tsar and Empress were dead, but the 4 Grand Duchesses, Olga, Tatiana, Maria and Anastasia, were still alive. They were huddled in corners, terrified and bleeding, but seemingly immune to the bullets. The executioners fired again, aiming directly at the girls' chests, but the bullets seemed to bounce off them, sparking as if hitting metal. One of the gunmen later recounted that he felt he was shooting at ghosts or witches, that the mad monk's dark magic was protecting the girls even after his death. Panic began to set in among the squad. They believed they were fighting supernatural beings, but the miracle was tragic, not divine. In their desperate attempt to save their family's fortune, the girls had sewn over 8 kilograms of diamonds and precious gems into the bodices of their corsets. They were unwittingly wearing bulletproof vests made of jewels. The diamonds, meant to buy their freedom in a new life, were now prolonging their agonizing death, deflecting the bullets and turning a quick execution into a slow, torturous slaughter. Realizing that guns were failing, Yurovsky screamed at his men to finish the job with bayonets and rifle butts. The scene that followed is too gruesome to describe in full detail, a frenzy of violence where the brutality of the revolution met the innocence of the fallen dynasty. The sickly Tsarevich Alexei, who was still breathing on the floor, was shot twice in the head by Yurovsky. The girls, protected by their diamond armour, had to be finished off with bayonets, fighting and screaming until the very end. Even the family's little French bulldog, Jimmy, was killed, his skull crushed with a rifle butt, a senseless act of cruelty that underscored the total dehumanization of the night. When the screaming finally stopped, the silence that fell over the Apatiev house was heavy and suffocating. The floor was a lake of blood. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes and stained with the evidence of the atrocity. The House of Special Purpose had become a slaughterhouse. As the executioners began to strip the bodies, they found the diamonds, discovering the mundane reason for the girls' immortality. But the feeling of dread didn't leave them. They had just wiped out the entire Romanov line in less than 20 minutes. The prophecy of Grigori Rasputin had come full circle with a terrifying accuracy that no one could have predicted. He had warned the Tsar, "If I am murdered by the nobles, no one of your family will remain alive for more than 2 years." Rasputin died in December 1916. The Romanovs died in July 1918. It had been 1 year and 7 months. The clock had run out. The mad monk had cast a long shadow from the grave, and in that blood-soaked basement, the Russian Empire officially ceased to exist, replaced by a new, brutal order born in violence. The bodies were wrapped in sheets and dragged out to a waiting truck, destined for a secret burial that was meant to erase them from history forever. But the story of the Romanovs and their dark prophet was far from over. The truck carrying the 11 corpses rumbled into the dark, mosquito-infested Koptyaki forest, driven by a man whose hands were shaking on the steering wheel, leaving behind a city that was waking up to a new, blood-soaked reality. The disposal of the bodies was a chaotic, botched operation that bordered on slapstick comedy. if the subject matter weren't so horrific. Yurovsky, the chief executioner, was frantic. He knew that if the White Army found the bodies, they would become relics, martyrs around whom a counter-revolution could rally, so his orders were to make the Romanovs vanish from the face of the earth completely. They arrived at a place called the Four Brothers, an abandoned mineshaft at a site known as Ganina Yama, just as the sun was coming up. Here, the final indignity began. The soldiers stripped the clothes off the dead bodies to burn them, and this was when they made the shocking discovery of the diamond armour in the daylight. As they ripped the corsets off the Grand Duchesses, pounds of pearls, diamonds and gemstones spilled out onto the grass, a glittering fortune that the girls had carried to their deaths. The soldiers, overcome by greed, began to pocket the jewels, stuffing the Romanov legacy into their dirty pockets, until Yurovsky threatened to shoot anyone who stole a single carat. They threw the naked bodies down the mineshaft and tossed in a few grenades, hoping to collapse the walls and bury the evidence, but the mine was too shallow. The water at the bottom didn't cover the bodies. The secret grave was visible to anyone who looked down. It was a disaster. To make matters worse, local peasants had seen the truck and the soldiers, and rumours were already spreading in the nearby village. Yurovsky, in a state of panic, realised he had to move the bodies again. The next night, exhausted and smelling of death, the Bolsheviks hauled the corpses back up out of the mineshaft, a gruesome task that took hours, and loaded them onto the truck to find a deeper, more secret location. But the Russian wilderness fought against them. The truck got bogged down in deep mud in a place called Porosenkov Log, a marshy hollow just a few miles away. The vehicle was stuck fast, the wheels spinning in the muck, and Yurovsky realised they could go no further. Dawn was approaching, and he made a snap decision. This muddy ditch would be the final resting place of the Romanov dynasty. What happened next was a calculated attempt to erase identity. They didn't just bury the bodies, they tried to chemically dissolve them. The squad had brought jars of concentrated sulfuric acid and gallons of kerosene. They smashed the faces of the Tsar and his family with rifle butts to make them unrecognisable, effectively erasing the features that had once appeared on millions of coins and stamps. They poured the acid over the bodies, watching the flesh hiss and burn, and then set fire to the remains. To confuse anyone who might find the grave in the future, Yurovsky came up with a diabolical plan. He separated two of the bodies, the Tsarevich Alexei and one of the Grand Duchesses, likely Maria, and buried them in a separate pit about 50 feet away. His logic was cold and precise. If treasure hunters found the main grave, they would find only 9 bodies, not 11. They would think it wasn't the royal family because the numbers didn't match. It was a forensic trick that would fool the world for decades. Once the gruesome work was done, they threw railway ties over the grave and drove the truck back and forth over the mud to pack it down. For the next 60 years, unsuspecting Russians would walk, drive and ride bicycles over that patch of road, completely unaware that the last emperor of Russia lay just a few feet beneath their boots. The cover-up was so successful that it inadvertently birthed the greatest mystery of the 20th century. Because the bodies were never found, and because the Bolsheviks initially lied, claiming only the Tsar was dead and the family had been sent to a safe place, the world refused to believe the truth. People couldn't accept that an entire dynasty could just vanish into thin air. Hope morphed into delusion, and the legend of the survivor was born. Whispers began to circulate that one of the daughters had escaped the slaughter, that the diamonds in her corset had deflected the bullets, and that she had been spirited away by a sympathetic guard. The name Anastasia began to be whispered in coffee houses and salons across Europe, a beacon of hope in a world shattered by war. The mad monk was dead, the Tsar was dead, but the story refused to die. Rasputin's influence had transcended the physical world. He had predicted the destruction of the family, but the mystery of their disappearance created a haunting afterlife that would torment the Bolsheviks and captivate the world for a century. The ghosts of the Romanovs were not resting. They were waiting to be found. For decades, the muddy grave in the Urals remained silent, hidden under a layer of rotting railway ties and the heavy boot of Soviet censorship. But while the bodies lay decaying in the dark, a phantom rose up to captivate the world, fueled by the desperate hope that Rasputin's prophecy had a loophole. In 1920, a young woman was pulled out of a canal in Berlin after a suicide attempt, shivering, scarred, and refusing to speak. When she finally broke her silence, she didn't give a name. She claimed to be the Grand Duchess Anastasia, the youngest daughter of the Tsar, the girl who had miraculously survived the massacre in the basement. This woman, who became known as Anna Anderson, sparked one of the greatest media frenzies of the 20th century, and her story became inextricably linked to the legend of the Mad Monk. She told gripping, detailed stories about life in the palace, about the jewels sewn into the corsets, and most chillingly, about Father Grigori. She claimed to remember Rasputin's piercing eyes, his smell, and the secrets he whispered to her mother, details that convinced many surviving aristocrats, and even some distant Romanov relatives, that she was the real deal. The world fell in love with the fairy tale, the princess who cheated death, the one spark of light in the darkness of the revolution. Hollywood made movies, books were written, and for 60 years the ghost of Anastasia danced through the public imagination, keeping the Romanov tragedy alive. But back in the Soviet Union, the Communist Party was paranoid. They knew the truth, that they had butchered a family in cold blood, but the location of the bodies was a state secret known only to a select few. The Apatiev House, the house of special purpose, still stood in Yekaterinburg, a grim monument to the regicide. By the 1970s, it had become a site of pilgrimage for secret monarchists and curious tourists, leaving flowers in the shadows. This terrified the Kremlin. In 1977, the head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov, fearing the house would become a shrine, ordered its destruction. The local party boss tasked with the demolition was a man named Boris Yeltsin, the future first president of Russia. In a twist of historical irony, Yeltsin bulldozed the house where the Tsar was killed, erasing the crime scene, but he couldn't erase the memory. While the government tried to bury the past, two amateur detectives, a geologist named Alexander Avdonin and a filmmaker named Gaily Ryabov, were secretly hunting for the grave. Working at great personal risk, using old maps and leaked memoirs from the executioners, they scoured the Koptyaki forest. In 1979, they found it. They thrust a probe into the marshy ground of Porosenkov log and hit wood, the railway ties. They dug quietly in the night and pulled out 3 skulls. The excitement was overwhelming, but the fear was greater. If the KGB caught them with the Tsar's skull, they would be sent to the Gulag. They reburied the bones and swore a pact of silence, waiting for the Soviet Union to collapse. That moment finally came in 1991. As the Red Empire fell apart, Avdonin revealed the location of the grave. The excavation was a global media event. Forensic scientists from around the world descended on the muddy pit, carefully extracting 9 skeletons. But there was a problem. The math didn't add up. There were 11 people killed in the basement, the family of 7, plus the doctor and 3 servants. But only 9 bodies were in the grave. 2 were missing, the Tsarevich Alexei and one of the daughters. The survivor myth exploded again. Was it true? Did Anastasia escape? Did the boy survive? The scientists turned to the ultimate truth-teller, DNA. In a groundbreaking act of international cooperation, they took samples from the bones and compared them to living relatives of the Romanovs. One of the key blood samples came from Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh and husband of Queen Elizabeth II, who was a direct descendant of the Romanov line. The results were conclusive. The bones belonged to the Tsar, the Empress, and 3 of their daughters. But the missing 2 bodies left a gaping hole in the closure, a final mystery that allowed the shadow of Rasputin's curse to linger just a little longer. It wasn't until 2007 that the final pieces of the puzzle were found. A separate dig site, the one Yurovsky had created to confuse the searchers, was discovered just 70 meters away from the main grave. Inside were 44 bone fragments, charred and broken, belonging to a teenage boy and a young woman. The DNA testing confirmed it. Alexei and Maria had been found. There were no survivors. The fairy tale of Anastasia was dead, proven to be a fantasy constructed by imposters like Anna Anderson, who was later proven by DNA to be a Polish factory worker named Franziska Szankowska. The grim reality was that Rasputin's prophecy had been fulfilled to the letter. The entire family was gone, wiped from the face of the earth, just as he had predicted. The mad monk had warned them that without him they would die, and history had proven him right in the most brutal way possible. Now only one thing remained: to bring the family home and finally lay the ghosts of the Russian Empire to rest. On July 17th, 1998, exactly 80 years to the day after the massacre in the cellar, a sombre procession moved through the streets of St. Petersburg, carrying small wooden coffins draped in the imperial flag towards the Peter and Paul Cathedral. It was the final act of the Romanov tragedy, a state funeral attended by presidents, princes, and the surviving descendants of the dynasty who had returned from exile to bury their dead. Russian President Boris Yeltsin stood before the open grave and bowed his head, delivering a speech that tried to heal the century-old wound, saying, "We are all guilty. It was a monstrous crime." As the coffins were lowered into the marble crypt, joining the remains of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, the physical bodies of the Tsar and his family were finally at rest. 2 years later, in the year 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church, the same church that had despised Rasputin, canonized Nicholas, Alexandra and their children as passion-bearers, saints who had faced death with Christian humility. The family that Rasputin had destroyed was now holy. But what of the mad monk himself? What happened to the man who started it all? Grigori Rasputin remains the restless ghost of Russian history, a figure who refuses to be buried by time. While the Romanovs have a marble tomb, Rasputin has no known grave. His ashes are scattered in the wind, becoming part of the very air of the country he prophesied would fall. In a bizarre twist that fits his chaotic life perfectly, his legend has only grown stranger in the modern age. There is a small, controversial museum in St. Petersburg that claims to possess the final gruesome relic of the holy man, a jar containing what is alleged to be Rasputin's severed manhood, a legendary object that has fascinated and disgusted tourists for years, serving as a grotesque symbol of the sexual obsession that defined his life. Whether the artifact is real or a fake is almost irrelevant. The fact that it exists at all proves that the world is still mesmerized by his physical power. To this day, there are fringe religious sects in Russia who treat Rasputin as a saint, painting icons of him with a halo, believing he was a true prophet who was misunderstood by a sinful world. They argue that he was the only one who tried to stop World War I, the only one who saw the cliff edge approaching, and that if the Tsar had listened to his advice on the war instead of his advice on ministers, the empire might have survived. Historians, however, generally view him as the catalyst for the collapse, the fatal error in the system. Rasputin was not a mastermind villain, nor was he a holy saint. He was a mirror reflecting the rot of the Russian Empire. He was a peasant who walked into a palace and showed the aristocracy their own irrelevance. His rise was only possible because the monarchy was already broken, isolated from reality, and desperate for a miracle. In the end, the story of Grigori Rasputin is the story of the 20th century's most spectacular collision between the ancient and the modern, between superstition and politics, between the flesh and the spirit. He was the man who could stop blood with a touch, but could not stop the bleeding of a nation. He was the dark force who loved the light of the chandeliers. He was the illiterate wanderer who wrote the final chapter of a 300-year-old dynasty. As we look back on his life, from the frozen mud of Siberia to the poisoned cakes of the Moika Palace, one thing remains undeniably true. He was right. His prophecy held. The Romanovs fell, the rivers turned red with blood, and the world changed forever. The mad monk may be dead, his ashes long gone, but in the dark corners of history his eyes still burn with that terrifying hypnotic fire. reminding us that sometimes truth is far stranger and far more terrifying than any fiction. This is the end of the Romanovs, but the legend of Rasputin will never die.